Hello, David. Thank you so much for appearing on the Emil Barna Podcast to discuss your most recent book, Brain Reset, where we'll be exploring a little bit of that today and kind of unpacking a few of the themes that come from this book and perhaps even some of your other books, which you're quite a prolific author and a researcher in terms of what interests you. You don't stick with one topic. I mean, looking through your bibliography, you've talked about diet, you've talked about, you've even written a cookbook, and you've went through narcissism and the brain and a few other areas as well. Yep. So I'm really interested to unpack what you want to unpack in today's interview. But before we get started, I just want to get you to tell the audience who you are, what you think is important about yourself that everyone should know, and we'll get stuck on into it.
Okay, so as you say, I guess I'm known as a non-fiction author mostly because of the first book I wrote, or the first book was published, which was a book called Sweet Poison. Came out 2007 or 8, and it was about how most of the health advice we were receiving about what to eat and what not to eat was wrong. It was a book that said that there's nothing wrong with eating fat, and there's an awful lot wrong with eating sugar, which at the time, I mean, that might sound like a fairly Captain Obvious statement now, but at the time, received a lot of flack. I was surprised by the fact that I was persistently attacked by the Heart Foundation, the Dietitians Association, you name it, for daring to suggest that there was something wrong with sugar. Things have moved on a bit since then, which is a good thing. But that book sold very, very well indeed. And when you do a non-fiction book that sells very, very well, your publisher will generally say to you, well, you write about things that interest you, and that's sort of what's happened to me. So I've written, as you say, about a lot of things, working with psychopaths and how to deal with it. How to select the best school for your kids in a book called Free Schools, other things around diet, etc. Having said all of that, I'm not a qualified dietitian. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an educator. I'm not qualified to write in any of the things that I write about. If you talk about formal qualifications, what I am is a lawyer, which means that I'm trained to examine evidence and to formulate that evidence in a way which is understandable to my client, which is, in essence, the Australian public. That's what I do. I research things that are interesting to me and write about what the research in the area says, rather than what the people who have money to make out of those areas of our lives want us to know. So the latest one, Brain Reset, is really about what do we know about the way the brain works and the way mental health works. And what is the research that's been conducted in the last 5 years, some very advanced research in neurochemistry, telling us about the connections between addiction, anxiety, and depression. And what implications does that have for the way we should conduct ourselves? How should we live our lives to cope with that? Particularly this wasn't written in anticipation of COVID-19. This was started well before it. But as it happens, COVID-19 is an accelerator of many things. And one of the things that is accelerated is an epidemic of mental health issues that was already occurring, and addiction issues that were already occurring in the population. But now they've been massively accelerated by lockdowns. It's timely in that sense, but that's more good luck than good management. That's what I've written about at the moment. But feel free to ask me about any of the things I've written about.
Oh, definitely. And I think this is really cool because I noticed while reading your book that COVID-19 does appear, and it seems, I'm not sure if it appears more later in the book, so that may reflect your writing process, starting beforehand, and then you kind of bring it in, which I think is really telling that you're able to move with the flow and integrate things that are happening in the here and now with what you've already started writing about. My question to you would be, because you write over so many different topics, when you go from one topic to another, and say someone asks you about, the previous topic, how well informed are you when you're trying to think about what you wrote, a few years ago, with when you're thinking about something different? How do you go with that?
I rarely abandon a topic just because a book comes out. I try to write regularly, and I publish the pieces I write on my website at davidgillespie.org. And that the reason I do that is partly for exactly what you're talking about, which is, I wrote a book about sugar in 2000, and I was published in 2008. But I've been researching it for years before that. So it would be easy now, some 13 years later, to have forgotten everything that I did then, or for the entire field to have moved on totally, and everything I knew then be completely irrelevant. So partially to guard against that, and partially because the reason I write in the first place is because I'm interested. I keep writing in the area. So just because it's not in the book doesn't mean I've stopped writing about it. So people who follow me on Facebook and who watch my website will know that I regularly publish articles, and those articles are not in any particular thing. Yes, they might skew towards the book that I've most recently released, but they're also from all over the place. So you'll see an article about the education system sitting right next to an article about some new study in sugar. So I just keep writing in the area, and that's a way of keeping up to date on what's going on.
And I like how you approach that, because partly the reason is, I remember one of my articles that keeps popping up for me is something that I wrote back when I was studying my undergraduate on autism and a few of that sort of stuff. But if you ask me right now what I wrote back then, I'd be like, I'm not quite sure. You'd have to go back to the article. For me, my brain may work a little bit differently in terms of retention. But you also said in the book that, and it picks up on how you've responded now, that depending on how you learn and how you go about teaching other people, that goes with the retention rate as well. So something like 90% of the information that you teach is retained after you've taught it, rather than just rote learning.
That's right. It's that old thing in medicine. I think I mentioned it in the book. Learn one, do one, teach one is the most effective way to learn.
Learn one, do one, teach one.
Teach one. So whatever it is that you're trying to get your head around, learn about it, then do it, then try to teach somebody else.
That's a good one, because in the therapy room, as a psychotherapist, I try to integrate the research that I come across with some of that clinical knowledge, and then integrating that with who's in front of me. And I often make the relationship between the head and the heart is one of the more important ones before you can step out and act on it.
Actually, I think I've probably misquoted that. It's probably watch one, do one, teach one. That's it. Yes. Watch one, do one, teach one.
It reflects, there was a really recent interview, probably not so recent, in a book published by Tim Ferriss called Tools of Titans. He picks up on that theme when he interviews a cook, and the cook was like, okay, goes to a cook school, and he asks, should I go to culinary school? And the cook comes back to him and says, okay, if you come to me today and you ask me for a job, I'll get you to peel some potatoes, and we can go from there. If you go to culinary school, spend tens of thousands of dollars, come back 2 years later, ask me for a job, I'll ask you to go in the kitchen and peel some potatoes. And so it's a matter of, how do you watch one, learn one, and then you teach one. It's such a universal theme. And
well, that actually, I mean, as I say in the book, that came from the way they trained doctors in the 19th century. Prior to that, they were just book learning. They're saying, here's a picture of the human body, here's things you need to know about it. And they were finding it was very, very ineffective in retention terms. And so this idea of watch one, do one, teach one became embedded in the way they teach doctors. And to this day, that's how doctors are trained.
Yeah, a lot of that practical element, and that's what it's good. I mean, you break your book up into a few different parts, and the last part of the book is around the practicalities of how do we understand what the peer-reviewed research is pointing towards, and what have we learnt to begin with. One thing I did learn actually from reading your book is delta phos B. Never heard of that before in my life until I came across it in your book. And I'd love you to guide our listeners. What the hell is delta phos B, and what does that mean for addiction and the rest of that?
Sure. Okay. Well, let's take one step back before delta phos B and think about dopamine, because underlying all of this is dopamine. So as you know, dopamine is what motivates us. It's often referred to as the pleasure hormone, but that's not really accurate. It motivates us towards pleasure and away from danger. It's our go hormone, a neurochemical that makes us move. So without dopamine, we wouldn't bother expending the energy to get something that we know is rewarding, like food, and we wouldn't bother expending the energy to run away from something that we know is dangerous. Dopamine takes us from thought into action. So we know that for a fact because of quite detailed experiments that have been done in animal models, where even if an animal is starving, if their dopamine receptors are disabled and food is placed right in front of their mouth, they will not move to get it. You put it in their mouth, they will. They'll eat it like crazy because they're starving, but they won't move without the dopamine connection. So dopamine is our motivator. And the stronger the dopamine signal, the more motivated we are to either chase the reward or run from the danger. So very basic architecture, works beautifully. We have an adjustment switch. So for many things with humans and other animals, we have to be able to adapt to the environment. We can't just assume it is always going to be 25 degrees and sunny. We have to be able to adapt to, say, variations in temperature. And so we have what are called epigenetic switches, which are switches in the way our brain is wired and the way our body is wired, that allow us to switch to a different state of operating so that things work more optimally. So we have one for heat, for example. So if we are in a hot environment, an epigenetic switch says this is persistently 35 degrees plus, and a switch switches, which changes a whole lot of systems in our body that deal better with heat. Same thing happens when it's cold. So we have these switches to help us adapt to the environment. One of the ones that we have is delta phos B, which is our switch for adapting to a high dopamine environment. So if we are in an environment where we are constantly being challenged with stimulation or threat, we need to be able to react to that appropriately. If a threat, for example, is only occasional, then it has to be a 4 bells alarm when something threatening happens. We have to have a huge dopamine spike. We have to react immediately. We have to go crazy. But if that same level of threat is happening all the time, then we don't want to overreact like that. We want to be able to screen out the background danger from the real immediate danger. So we need to raise the level at which we react. And that's what delta phos B does. So it changes our baseline. It says, okay, here's your baseline level, but you seem to be in a high threat environment, say at war. So we'll screen out all the background danger, the faraway explosions, and so on, and we'll pay attention only to the ones which are immediately dangerous. And that's what delta phos B is doing. It's raising the base level. Same thing happens on the reward side, because the body reuses this stuff on both sides of the equation. And it says, if we're in a high reward environment, so say we have all the food we could eat, and we can eat whenever we want, however we want. The body does the same thing. It says, okay, well, food is rewarding and we need it and we need to chase it, and we get a dopamine rush when we see it. But if we're surrounded by it all the time, then we raise the baseline level to only pay attention to the things which are really rewarding, not just the background. And we know this feeling when we experience it on the reward side, because something that the first time we encountered it was massively rewarding and we got a huge jolt out of it. But then it happens every day. And it's no longer as rewarding. We tolerate it. We start to become adapted to it, and it's not as big a thrill. One thing, a story I didn't put in the book, but I remember the first time I went to McDonald's. Yes, I am that old. When McDonald's came to Australia, one of the first ones opened in Brisbane, and I remember being taken there when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11 years old by my parents, and it was a massive thrill, incredible. Never seen anything like it before in my life, and a real treat. But then when I'm a teenager, I'm going every day or every other day or whatever it is, and there's no giant party thrill about that anymore. And that's that feeling of adaptation is what Delta Phos B does on the reward side too, which is it raises your baseline level. Now, when it's raised like that, the whole wiring of the brain gets adapted to make it necessary for rewards to be more rewarding in order to turn you on, to motivate you to go, and also for danger to be more dangerous in order to make you to move. It also, unfortunately, affects the way we calculate risk, which is really bad, and I'll explain why. It increases the loading on our risk calculation, meaning that we perceive things to be more rewarding than they are, and we perceive things to be more dangerous than they are once the Delta Phos B level is too high. That risk miscalculation on the reward side is what we call addiction, which is we perceive something which we know to be rewarding to be more rewarding in anticipation than it actually is. And on the risk side, we perceive the danger to us to be more dangerous than it actually is. And we call that anxiety. So we worry about something that is not really dangerous, and that's what we call anxiety. And we chase something that's not really as rewarding as we think, and we call that addiction. So that's the consequence of this. Now, you might say, well, that's a pretty bad design if that's the way it's going to happen. But remembering, this is meant to be a temporary solution. This is meant to be a temporary raise of an epigenetic switch, a temporary rewiring to allow us to cope with a change in our environment. We're suddenly in a war zone, we have to cope with that. We're suddenly in a high reward environment, we have to cope with that. But the idea with all epigenetic switches is that when that emergency state goes away, everything goes back to normal. The problem with Delta Phos B is it has a very slow decay. Epigenetic switches normally switch very, very quickly. So if the temperature were to suddenly drop and I'd been wired for being at 35 degrees and suddenly it's 20 degrees, it'll happen within hours. The epigenetic switch will reset, the body will reset, everything's good. But the one that we're talking about, Delta Phos B, doesn't reset that quickly. It takes about 3 months to reset. Wow. So every time you experience something dangerous or stressful, it notches up 1. Every time you experience something pleasurable, it notches up 1. By the way, it doesn't care whether it's danger or pleasure that's notching it up. And it takes 3 months to bring it back down again. That means, and I talk about, there's a study in the book I talk about where they actually did a post-mortem test on drug addicts and found that their Delta Phos B switches were still set to addiction 9 days after they died. So they're still addicts even after they're dead. Now that's an interesting analysis of the Delta Phos B switch because it shows that decay is inevitable but slow, and even death doesn't interrupt it.
So even in death, they can explore what's going on, how the brain is switching on and off from a very genetic.
That's right, from a neurochemical perspective. So they can measure the level of Delta Phos B. Unfortunately, the only way to measure the level of Delta Phos B is to cut someone's brain open. So I've had a lot of people who've heard me say all of what I've just said to you and say, oh, can I get a diagnostic test for that? Well, yes, you certainly can, but you have to be dead first.
And if I recall correctly, the study you refer to was measuring heroin, people who have a heroin addiction. That's correct. Okay. And then you've got methamphetamine, for example, which completely rebalances the brain's response to dopamine in particular, much much more than other types of stimulants. And
well, all stimulants, at the end of the day, I mean, it's a question of degree, but all stimulants give you a dopamine hit. And every time you get a disproportionate dopamine hit, you will change the delta phosphate setting in the brain.
And does delta phosphate only work for dopamine?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's a permanent record of dopamine hits, is a way to think of it, that decays over time.
All right, I understand. And in the book, there's a story that came up, from my father, who immigrated from Romania in the late 80s. He escaped the communist regime back in that time, and he came to Australia as a refugee. And when he came to Australia, he went to a McDonald's, and there were no McDonald's back where he was at, and he was just like, he goes to the front counter, and he asks the person at the front counter, "Can I have McDonald's?" The person is like, "Yeah, we've got lots of things. What would you like?" "I want some McDonald's." Because the only time that he'd heard of it is like, "Oh, have you had McDonald's?" He just wanted to go, and he ended up getting a Big Mac or something. But when you report what your experiences with McDonald's first, and then I used to work at McDonald's when I dropped out of school back in year 10, before I smartened up a little bit more and decided to do something with my life. I was working full-time, eating McDonald's every single day, but my metabolism was quite high, and so I didn't get fat, to put it bluntly, but I wasn't healthy at the time. And so I can relate to some of the dietary considerations, because we do cover the dietary considerations in previous books, but you also mentioned addiction as related to diet and different types. And that's what I found really interesting in this book, that you cover so much ground in terms of different types of addictions. One which I noted down, you talked about approval porn. Yes. Tell our audience about what you mean by approval porn.
Okay, so let's think about let's start with what it is in real life. So in real life, we humans like pleasing other humans. So we like meeting other people, and we like doing things that they tell us they like us doing. It's often in a negatory way called peer pressure, but it's actually happening all the time. It's what keeps us behaving well with strangers. It's a unique thing to humans, that we work well as groups, and the reason we do that is that we like to do things that the group of people around us want done. So in the biochemistry behind that is that we get a little shot of oxytocin, which is a very pleasurable feel-good hormone, which gives us a dopamine hit when we do something that other people like. You can get a shot of oxytocin right now just by patting your dog. By the way, the dog will get one too, and that's working as designed. Giving your wife a hug, giving your kids a hug, give you a shot of oxytocin. Going out and hanging out with a group of your friends and doing things that they show to you that they like will also give you a shot of oxytocin. So that's how it works in real life. Nothing wrong with any of that. In fact, it's very good. For a long time, people who wanted to make addictive software were unable to crack, how do we simulate that? I mean, they'd simulated other ways of addiction, because one way to make a software addictive is to find something in real life that we find rewarding and then run it at high speed in a simulation in software. So we're all familiar with this. Gambling apps do this. Gaming does this. It runs a high-speed simulation of putting yourself in danger, which, by the way, remember, danger stimulates dopamine just as much as reward. So when you go out and you play a first-person shooter, you're doing that. You're running a high-speed simulation of danger. So they knew, and porn, sexual porn, is also a high-speed simulation of sex. Which we know is rewarding to humans. So, but the tough nut to crack for people who wanted to addict humans is, well, there's this other really addictive thing that humans do, or potentially addictive thing, or rewarding thing that humans do, which is that they enjoy socializing with each other. So how do we run a high-speed simulation of that? And that nut was cracked with social media. So the easy way to do it is have the people post something to a large group of strangers and have them get instant feedback that they are liked. So you'll notice Facebook does not have a dislike button, and there's a very good reason for that. The addictive element is the like. The addictive element is feeding back to you that you have done something that a large group of humans really like, and they've told you that. And every time that like hits, you get a shot of oxytocin, and that's the addiction mechanism. I call that approval porn. Anything that communicates approval to you in a high-speed simulation is approval porn. Why porn? Because porn was the original of all of this, but they're not selling sex, they're selling approval. Now, the next step, by the way, is to go one step further and combine the sex and the approval, and you've got gambling apps. Gambling, that's right. You've got dating apps. Yeah. Combine the sex and the approval, dating app.
Yeah, you make the swipes. I think the when you settle onto someone, that's often a result of thousands upon thousands of different mechanisms that are at work, and the swiping left, swiping right. You could swipe like thousands of the variable interval.
Well, I think I actually go through in the book. I can't remember off the top of my head what they are, but it is many thousands. It's tens of thousands of swipes before anyone settles on someone. Is the analysis on that, and it's just a different mechanism. It's trying to combine two addictions at the same time. If they could also incorporate danger porn, that is the simulation that's being run in gaming and gambling apps, into a dating app, then that would be super addictive. No one's done that yet, but give them a moment or two, I'm sure they'll think of it.
All right. Do you have any ideas on how to create one of those?
Well, I really don't want people to become addicted to software, but the really interesting question that I guess we as a society have to ask is, why are we giving organizations whose only purpose is to addict us for profit a license to operate? I mean, the only purpose of Facebook is to addict us so they can sell us stuff. Just as much as the only purpose of a gambling organization is to addict us so they can take our money. Why do we give organizations whose only purpose is addiction, and the consequence of addiction is anxiety and depression, which we can talk about in more detail, but why are we giving them a license to operate at all?
That's the question, and a lot of that refers back, as I'm sure you and our listeners well know, profit takes precedence, it appears.
Yeah.
And
well, there's some forms of addiction we're not prepared to put up with. So we don't put up with meth being sold at the supermarket. We draw a line somewhere, but there is still an awful lot of addiction legally and freely available.
Oh, it certainly is, and that's been the case for thousands upon thousands of years. I think one of the things.
Well, actually, no, really, it hasn't, and that's the interesting bit when you get into this. The only really generally available addiction prior to probably the last few hundred years was alcohol. So if you look at addictive substances that were available to the entire population, and even then it wasn't the entire population, but let's just go with a large percentage of the population. Alcohol is pretty much it. It's only in the last few hundred years that we've really broadened the availability of stimulants. So things like cocaine, all the derivatives of opium, cocaine, methamphetamines, or on the stimulant side of the equation, all of those things have really only come into their own in the last 150 years. Lower level addictions like caffeine and sugar have been there a little bit longer, but they're not heavy duty, and they weren't really particularly available. Sugar was one of the most expensive things you could buy, even only 250 years ago, from a food perspective. And even gambling was heavily restricted until the 90s. So you couldn't just gamble. You had to probably bet on the horses. You had to do it in a premises that permitted overage access, something like a tab or something like that. And you had to hang out with some fairly undesirable people to do it. It was not something that everybody had access to. So whilst the current reality is you can gamble on anything at any time, anywhere, and you can game at any time and anywhere, and you can access addictive software and behaviours at will, often at no cost. That is a very, very recent phenomenon, and it is really, to be able to do it for free and to be able to do it by everybody in the population, including children, is really recent.
All right, I see what you're saying. I'll pick up with Marcus Aurelius, because you do touch base on the availability of opium in the book.
Yes.
And that's a contrasting factor to what you've mentioned in terms of the availability.
All of the plant-based stimulants have to some degree or another in various societies been available, but not to any huge degree. In Roman times, yes, opium was available, and probably more available than we think it was, in that it was basically used as a headache tablet. But it still wasn't available to everybody all the time, not by a long shot.
And that's an interesting, because I wasn't aware of the ancient Roman habits. I mean, alcohol is a no-brainer. It's been around since they've let grapes rot and kind of go from there. So, but Marcus Aurelius, guy who wrote Meditations, died of an opium overdose.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's hard to confirm because I wasn't actually there, but the evidence I examined seems to suggest it's likely. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, lawyer by trade or by training, you chose to write this book on addiction. What made you take that route in terms of this particular book? What motivated you?
Well, one of the other things that I've done in my long career is I've also worked as a chief technical officer in a startup company, a venture capital funded startup software company in the United States. I maintain an interest in that area. I still have investments in software companies. So I know how coding works. I know how programming works. I know how the business structure of that business works. And when I see businesses like Facebook, and this is not just Facebook, but like Facebook, investing billions in the development of code, which they then give away for free, I always am curious about the business model that underlies that, because it's on the surface insane. Why would you waste billions of dollars to develop the very best code you can and then give it away? And the answer is because they're not giving it away. What they're doing is wanting to addict you to their code. Why do they want to addict you? Well, there's plenty of people developing exactly the same thing. There's nothing special about Facebook. There's hundreds of thousands of apps that do exactly the same thing. But they're the ones that own the desktop space or the space on your phone. So how do they do that? Well, they're the ones who are better at addicting their customers. Because at the end of the day, when all you're selling is time, you better be addictive or you're going to be replaced instantly by someone who is. So I was interested in that model, and I was interested in its effect on my kids, and on the kids I was seeing around me, and my friends' kids. And I could see that there was something really, really dangerous going on with these kids being purposefully addicted by software companies whose only mission is to sell them a different pair of shoes, but whose tool of choice, addiction, has a lot of really, really bad collateral damage associated with it. And this is the important point to take away from this. It's all well and good to get excited about addiction, but the interesting question is, what does it do to us? That rewiring of delta phos-B, that overestimation of danger and reward, is what we call anxiety. If there is a connection, the biochemistry says there's a strong connection between delta phos-B being out of whack and people being anxious and depressed. And if that's true, then in the last 10 years, as we've distributed vast quantities of addictive software to everyone who wants it, we should see a massive increase in anxiety and depression, particularly in the most easily addicted age group, which is teenagers. I can go into why if you want to, but they are biochemically the most easily. So we'll do that in a sec, but you would want to see stats that confirm that. You'd want to see, okay, are addiction and anxiety going off the scale at a time when we've distributed devices which addict to the population? Answer, yes. So prior to COVID, this is prior to COVID, in the 6 years between 2010 and 2016, teenage anxiety in Australian adolescents increased by 60%. So this is not something that's 60% is massive in this area. This is not something that moves that fast. And we're seeing those numbers look insignificant now once you add in COVID. And I can explain why COVID matters in a little while. But let's first of all just go back to why it's teenagers. As you know, with any kind of addiction, the age group most affected is teenagers or adolescents from sort of start of puberty for plus 10 years. So 12 to 22. If you look at any demographic study of anything addictive in the population, you'll see most of your addicts are adolescents. They're in that age group. The reason for that is because in that age group, the human body dials down something called GABA, which is a suppressant. The reason it does that is so that puberty can start. The trouble is that GABA is also used to suppress dopamine hits. What turns off a dopamine hit is GABA. So if there's 10 years in your life when your brain has the brakes removed, that is the thing that dampens down dopamine and therefore makes things less addictive and less stressful, is turned off, then by definition, that age group is going to be when people are most likely to be addicted and most likely to be stressed. It's fairly simple biochemistry, nothing controversial about any of that. Same thing applies to addictions which are engineered into software, and the people who make the software know that too, which is why their target demographic is that age group. So that's who they're trying to addict, that's who they do addict, so that they can sell them stuff.
All right.
Can't remember what the question was, but
the question was why? Why does it matter? Well, you've answered that one. You've also brought to the fore the COVID-19 and the implications of COVID.
Oh yeah, okay.
So
COVID-19. Yeah. So why does that matter? Well, because remember, it's not just addiction that rewires that set point, the delta phosphate we talked about. It's also stress. Stress is created by uncertainty. The more uncertain your environment, the more stressed you will be. So humans like predictability. Humans like things to be boring. And the delta phosphate raising is our adaptation to things being uncertain. So, that famous saying, "May you live in interesting times," is in fact a curse. They're wishing ill upon you by saying, "May you live in interesting times," because your brain doesn't want to live in interesting times. So uncertainty creates stress and raises delta phosphate. And the higher delta phosphate is raised, the more poorly we predict the danger, the more poorly we overestimate the danger from uncertainty, and the worse it gets. So it puts us into a bit of an uncertainty spiral. COVID-19 has accelerated all of that for all of us. So first of all, there's the uncertainty associated with the disease. It's terrifying, frankly, to think of a disease that could infect you at any time, any place, in a completely random fashion. This is, of course, by the way, why police always try to, when they make an announcement about a crime that's been committed, someone's been stabbed or murdered or whatever, they'll always say the person was known to the victim if they were. Meaning there's a reason why this crime occurred. It was not random. It is not traveling through the community. You could be randomly struck down. So disease, you can't do that. Disease could strike anyone at any time. So that in itself is uncertain. Layer in the government response to it, where you weren't certain whether you're even going to be allowed to go out next Tuesday, let alone be able to plan anything in the future, and you suddenly are putting yourself under continuous levels of stress. Our response to that, by the way, is to do something which relieves that stress. And one of the things that relieves stress is to go and get a hit of dopamine, which takes us back up to that baseline level. Remember, the body is saying, here's our baseline level now. So the body says, well, how do we get dopamine up to that baseline level? Well, let's go get hit of dopamine. We can either do something stressful and dangerous, like, I don't know, go rock climbing or something, Or if you're in lockdown, have a drink, or otherwise access something that raises dopamine. So gaming, gambling, drinking. And that's why all of those things have increased 20 to 40% in the last year, because that's our natural response. Unfortunately, that natural response just raises the required level even higher. So it works immediately, but in the medium to long term, it just makes the problem worse. So
it makes, yeah.
No,
go on.
So the consequence of COVID-19 is we've accelerated something that happens anyway. So in normal times, we get stressed. Delta phosphate goes up. We try to relieve it with something addictive. Delta phosphate goes up, and it's a vicious circle. Then we're more stressed, and then more. COVID-19 has just compressed and accelerated that and made it much worse, which is why we're seeing levels of anxiety and depression in the United States, for example, where they are constantly measuring this, go from about 11% in the population prior to COVID-19 to about 40% now. So that is a truly massive change, but it's accelerating something that would have occurred over probably the next decade anyway.
Is that because it's an interesting thing that people like to is the mental health element a reaction to the threat of the disease, or is it the uncertainty of the political response to that disease? Because
it's both of those things. It's both of those things. So it's the uncertainty and danger of the disease itself, which is to varying degrees. Some people will say, I don't believe the disease is dangerous at all. Other people will say, I think it's life-threatening. So they'll have varying responses. But to the people who think it's dangerous, the uncertainty around it certainly is bad for them. To people who don't think it's dangerous, the uncertainty about the government response to it is equally dangerous.
And I think that's an important point. I have two episodes that I've published on the podcast, one of which I review the peer-reviewed research around mental health impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns. So I took a lockdown approach in that measure, and the other one was an interview with a neuroscientist and, funnily enough, a psychopathy researcher who by the name of James Fallon. Now he talked about how the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic appear to be so much more pronounced in the disadvantaged communities, more so than any others. I mean, we who are in the laptop class and can conduct the work that we do.
That's because the level of uncertainty is greater.
Yeah.
If what you're worrying about is whether you have a job tomorrow, or whether you have a house tomorrow, then you have a continuous high level of stress. So your delta phosphate is continually being ramped up, and you will need higher and higher levels of addictive substances to address that. So it's just how much stress is applied. For someone who has a job they can do with a laptop and has a home they know they will have and be able to pay for, those two elements of stress, housing and financial insecurity, which are huge levels of stress, are removed from the equation. So it's less stressful for them. So it's not surprising at all that these impacts will be hitting lower down in the socioeconomic scale.
It does, and it's like with anything, it tends to affect those who are the most disadvantaged more than anyone else. I mean, there's a recent story, really interesting.
So the interesting thing, sorry to interrupt, but the interesting thing is the cure to it is to give them money, which is what the federal government did last year. They gave them money. And so you saw, when you look at the statistics in Australia, the anxiety and depression stats during the phase of money being given to people was much, much lower than you would have expected given COVID-19. As soon as the giving money to people bit stopped, those stats started going bad. But the solution to housing and financial insecurity and the uncertainty that comes from that, and therefore the stress and the anxiety, is of course to just give people money. Strangely, the cure for poverty is giving people money.
I wonder why. That's an interesting point. I can't remember where I was going with that.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think it was an important point. So I guess one of the things I found interesting, if we return back to your book as well, was the impact of chronic stress on on people. And you mentioned a really interesting study, a rat study. And I did a bit of research around this because these rats were deprived of many different things, and they were actively purposely stressed for 12 weeks or 8 to 12 weeks it was, which, looking at, if we compare that to our life, a person who lives 80 years, that's like us being stressed out for six straight years. Being poked, being being
irritated,
music. Well,
made their bedding wet, put their cages on an angle, played loud music.
And then they measured those who had their delta FOSB or the dopamine receptors switched on and switched off. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that study and what that means for us, if you recall the nuances of it?
I don't know the detail of it, but I do remember the takeaway message from it. The first big thing about that study was that it showed definitively that you can produce exactly the same biochemical response with stress as you can with addiction. So they compared it to prior rat studies where they already knew you can raise delta FOSB levels by exposing rats to cocaine. Easy, that can be measured. It's predictable. It's theory. What they hadn't proven was that you can do the same thing with stress. So these rats were not addicted. They were just normal rats that they had a way of turning on and off their dopamine receptors using a really smart trick. I think that was the one that used lights to do it. But what they proved was stress has the same effect, puts you in exactly the same state, puts the biochemistry in the same place as if you were an addict. And then I think it was that experiment where they went on to do the second phase of the study, where they found that the rats that they had stressed like that were more easily addicted after they'd done that. And that was predictable as well. And that's just that crossover thing, which is the brain doesn't care where the delta FOSB adjustment comes from, whether it's from stress or from addiction. It still behaves regardless, seeking out more addiction and being adapted to more stress. The other thing that it showed with the stressed animals is that they became docile. So they became much more compliant with what was going on. They could be hurt more easily, wouldn't react as strongly. They were basically depressed. And that was an interesting connection to draw as well, is that this tolerance that comes from the delta FOS being raised too high also not only results in an addictive state of mind, but that addictive state of mind puts them into a mind frame which we would describe as depressed.
It's groundbreaking. Have you heard of the rat park experiment?
No, I'm not sure.
Not sure.
Tell me what happened in it and I'll let you know.
Well, so there was the conditioning experiment where you put rats in a cage, and then you put some water laced with a particular drug, and then the rats are usually just gonna tap at the lever and get that fixed. Yes. But I mean, why wouldn't a rat do that if that's the only stimulation that they had? And so that was where the old mental models of addiction came about in terms of a neurochemical difference. So someone questioned, a researcher, I can't remember who it was, questioned that way of going about researching addiction. So what they did was they put the rats into a beautiful park area that was all maintained. They had fertile mates. They had all these things to eat. They had all these lovely friendships to make, and then they also had water that was laced with cocaine or some other thing. Now the rats who were in that rat park didn't grab onto the cocaine, even though they knew it was there, in nowhere near as much of a frivolity or whatever you want to call it as the previous
frequency. Ones. And I think I mentioned that study. I'm not sure, but I think I mentioned it towards the end when I talk about what you can do about it. And I'm conscious of the time, and I really do want to get to the what you can do about it.
Please do.
So what it boils down to is find something else that stimulates dopamine, but at lower, more continuous levels. And that's what that rat experiment was showing. is that if there's lots of things that would stimulate dopamine, so they could meet other rats, mate with them, explore their environment, all of those things stimulate dopamine for a rat. And so there were plenty of sources of low-level dopamine stimulation for the rats. So the source that gave them an instant hit, whilst still attractive, was nowhere near as attractive if it was the only source of a stimulation. And that kind of underlies the message I want from the back of this, which is you can do something about this. What you're trying to do is get your lower your delta phos-B level, get that to decay over time. In order for that to happen, what you have to do is remove the big dopamine spikes that keep pushing it up. So that means take away the big stresses in your life. Some of them are well beyond your control. You can't take away COVID, you can't take away government responses to it, but you can take away some of the uncertainty around it. So you can say, okay, you know what? This is a reality. I'm going to plan out my week, and there's not going to be any uncertainty. I'm going to know what I'm going to eat on Tuesday night. I know when I'm going to shop. I know where I'm going to shop. I know where I'm going to exercise. It's all planned. There's no uncertainty. So you can't take away the big uncertainty, but you can take away the small, and it helps. The other thing you can do is on the positive side, which is find things like for those rats, find things which stimulate dopamine in a natural, low, continuous way, rather than hunting for those spikes that the rats who only had that one choice could do. So what are things like that in real life? Well, for humans, some of the things that are the same for the rats, which is meet people, socialize with them, do things they like. More possible in Brisbane at the moment than in Melbourne, but still, let's go back
you
to
guys.
more normal times. Other things you can do is find something that causes you to focus. So I was listening to a great interview yesterday with a magician who you probably are familiar with on TikTok. I don't know his proper name, but he goes by Ash Magic. And he has millions of followers on TikTok. He's a 19-year-old Australian, and he does incredible magic. And
I have to look at it.
Hearing him talk about why he started doing magic, he had terrible anxiety and ADHD. ADHD, by the way, is a consequence of the same architecture that we don't have time to go into. And he took up magic because he was interested in it, but he found he required enormous focus to get it right. And if you've ever tried doing magic, it's practice, practice, practice. It's getting that movement exactly right. And he did that, and he's now to the point where he's incredible. I recommend going watching some of his tricks. They're really quick and they're impressive. But he's incredible. And he says that when he's doing magic, he feels a lot better. And that's what I'm talking about. Something that you can focus on. Now, for all of us, that'll be different. It might be stamp collecting. It might be reading a book. It might be playing chess. It might be playing a sport. But whatever, it's got to be something that requires all of your attention. So, for example, for you, it might be doing this, which is you can't just sit there and nod. You actually have to focus on what I'm saying or what your next guest is saying, and you have to listen and you have to be able to respond on the fly. That requires enormous amounts of focus. And that is the kind of activity that all of us need to get away from the high dopamine levels that are stimulated by addiction and stress.
Thank you so much for joining me today, David. And for all our audience who want to know a little bit more about you, actually, I'm just going to plug it again. Thank you I want to thank Pan Macmillan actually for sending this book through to me, and you for writing it. Brain Reset. Everybody who's interested in learning more about dopamine, check this book out. Best-selling researcher, author, awesome things. Now, I would want to say that actually, I want to ask you, where can people find you if they want to learn a little bit more about yourself?
Okay, so Facebook, just look for David Gillespie. I'm verified on Facebook, so pretty easy to find. Or davidgillespie.org. Also on Twitter, once again, verified account David Gillespie. So easy enough to find.
All right.
Just search on those platforms.
Anything else you want to say before we wind up?
Not at all. Happy to come back another time, Emil, if you want to get deeper into some of these topics. I'm sorry I had to cut it short today.
I really appreciate you stepping up and moving forward with this. And I might have to hold you on to that offer. So thank you so much for joining me again. I wish you the very best, and hopefully our move forward is much less stressful.
Yes, indeed. Thanks,
Have a
Emil.
good day. Bye-bye.